Hey guys, it's Comic Hollywood Studios here. I know it's a very different video format than usual, but I wanted to do this a little differently. Obviously today is March 13th, which is my birthday, but more importantly, it is the 3-year anniversary since COVID started. If you guys remember, March 13th, March 12th, that whole time in 2020 was when the world kind of seemed to shut down, and that included our precious theme parks and amusement parks. I was actually visiting an amusement park the day all the shutdowns started. I was at American Dream for Nickelodeon Universe on one of the last days they were open before they shut down for the pandemic. I think I missed the shutdown by like 3 days. I got very lucky, but it was really close, and obviously with that all happening, there were a ton of changes that happened at parks. It's pretty crazy now that pretty much all the restrictions that were there are now gone. But I think it'd be cool to take a look back at some of the restrictions that were put in place during that whole time, since after all, we're 3 years ahead now, and it's cool to take a look back. So I went to quite a few amusement parks back in 2020. Obviously, I went to Six Flags Great Adventure, which is my home park. They had a lot of different policies for COVID. Of course, all of the parks had the mask mandate for the entirety of 2020, at least post-March and April. For the parks I went to, at least, you had to wear a mask. And the social distancing, it wasn't really too strict from what I remember. They had the markers all over the place, and they still do have some of the markers at different parks depending where you go. But I do remember they were pretty lax on the social distancing, and people didn't really seem to care much either from what I remember, which was of course interesting. I remember on Great Adventure's opening day of 2020, El Toro had horrible capacity because they would only keep one row per car open. So that's only 6 rows on the entire train, and it was the front row of every car. So you couldn't even get the magic seat on El Toro at that point. They did wind up changing it later on where it had to be 1 row in between groups. Of course, if you have a giant group, you could just stack all together, and it was great. But there were a lot of really weird policies. They had the plexiglass set up in some of the queues, I remember, especially in the stations. And that was actually there for a very long time. I remember Nitro and the other B&M coasters were some of the first ones to have it. These giant walls in the middle of the queue, well, in between rows when you're inside the station. And you had the stickers on it saying, "Do not touch." Of course, we would all mess around and look at each other through it. And then Toro and Mine Train eventually had them too, which was really weird, especially with Toro, because Toro has one of the longest trains of any coaster I know of. So it's just rows of plexiglass when you walk into the empty station, which was always really weird to look at. And like I said, a lot of those plexiglass things stayed up pretty much for 2 years. I mean, a lot of them weren't even removed until 2022, which was wild. Mask mandates were dropped in, I believe, May of 2021, which again is pretty crazy. At least at Great Adventure, that's how it was. But other than Great Adventure, we were at Dorney Park. Dorney Park was pretty similar. And something I should mention is that they all had really weird getting in setups, like the security and ticketing. Security was definitely better at some parks than others. At Great Adventure, of course, we had that lovely tent for 2 years, where they had actually really good security setup, and finally in 2022 they made it pretty permanent and replaced that stupid white tent with a nice new entrance. And at all the Six Flags parks pretty much had the same setup. Cedar Fair parks, I remember not being too different either. I think the only Cedar Fair park I was at in 2020 was Dorney Park, and they did a really good job with all the COVID procedures and whatnot. Hershey Park was also pretty good. They were stacking all the queues, packing the queues pretty tight. So I do remember that. I mean, I wasn't too affected by it personally, but I know for people that were a little more cautious with it, maybe they were having some issues with that. But I do remember like waiting in line for Candemonium, and the station was packed with people. And of course, you have other parks out west. We went to Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. And those parks were definitely a little more lax on their rules too. But they still had them in place, of course. Silver Dollar City specifically, I remember when we were first walking in, they made me answer like a series of questions. They didn't do any checks. They just kind of asked, "Are you sick? Do you feel okay? Do you have any symptoms?" And that was about it. They let you in. And they gave you like a little wristband too, I remember, to say that you got checked for the medical screening, which I thought was interesting. That was the only park I remember doing that I visited in 2020. The Six Flags parks, we went to Six Flags St. Louis, Over Texas, Frontier City, and Fiesta Texas, and they were all pretty much identical across the board. Nothing really different across them. One interesting thing was that the 2 mountain coasters in Branson, Missouri, which was the Branson Coaster and I believe Runaway Mountain Coaster, there was no kind of COVID requirements or anything. I don't even think you had to wear a mask. So I guess it was kind of nice to get that breath of fresh air. We didn't have to wear the mask out, so that was cool. And it wasn't very crowded at either of those places either, which was nice. I do remember SeaWorld was very similar to a lot of the other parks with the distancing. They took it pretty seriously there too. And I of course remember all the cleanings they used to do at all the parks. And that's one thing that personally I remember thinking they weren't really going to go through with, but at certain parks they were very strict about it. They would not run the trains until they were all nice and clean, which honestly was nice because at least you knew that like if someone had thrown up prior or something like that, that was all gone, so you didn't have to think about that. That is one thing I wouldn't mind staying from back in the COVID days where they had to sanitize the trains. Of course, it was horrible for capacity and the queuing and everything. It would slow things down really badly, but it was still nice to know that you were getting in a nice clean seat, even if it was soaking wet because they didn't want to dry it. Other things, I'm trying to think. The restrictions as time went on slowly got pulled back more and more. I know all the parks had a really big struggle when they were first opening, back around like July 4th. That was where the last park openings kind of happened, at least over here. I know the West Coast had a lot of delayed openings, same with other parks like Carowinds, I believe, and Six Flags New England. They were not able to open for 2020 from what I remember. But there was a lot of issues. There was crowd control issues as well. I remember all the reservation systems. Oh man, don't miss those. And I think Disney finally got rid of them, unless they still have them. I haven't been to Disney in forever. But the reservation systems were really, really annoying. It was nice that you could pretty much go to the park, and if you forgot to make a reservation, you could just make one while you're there. But it was pretty frustrating to have to make all those reservations and deal with that nonsense, especially because in the end, I don't think the parks really limited capacity very much at all. And if they did, it was kind of unintentional because people weren't really going to the parks as much as they had prior. So it just kind of worked out. But I do remember that being a bit of a hindrance to the experience. There was a lot of things that were unfortunate, like a lot of the indoor rides were closed. Remember when we went out west to Six Flags St. Louis, Six Flags Over Texas, I was really looking forward to trying out their Justice League Dark rides just to see how it compared to Great Adventures. Of course, both of them were closed because of all the restrictions and whatnot, which was unfortunate, but I guess that does make sense. And then as we moved into 2021, like I said, restrictions definitely started to ease up. I remember in June, we did a little trip around all the parks around here, and the only park that actually required a mask at that time was Luna Park in Coney Island, New York, but they didn't actually enforce it. It was really weird. So we walked into the one area of Luna Park, and we saw the workers didn't have masks on. Other guests didn't have masks on, so we just kind of took that as we didn't have to wear our masks either, and no one said anything to us, so that was kind of interesting too, I remember. And there were other things too, especially Universal. Universal, of course, there's a lot of international tourism at Universal, and of course there were plenty of mask wearers, which is fine. I understand that, and it was very, very crowded, even though it was still coming off the heels of COVID. But I do remember you would have the spiel for social distancing play while you're in queue for a ride, and I specifically remember this at Shrek 4D. Right after that social distancing, I guess, spiel played, they would then tell you to move in as much as you possibly can, which was so counterintuitive. It was really funny at the time, but that was definitely probably the most COVID unfriendly park from what I remember. Universal was very crowded, and it was definitely very easy to get sick there. Thankfully, it wasn't too bad, but after that, pretty much everything eased up as we went into 2022, and there are still remnants. I think it's really funny too when you'll see like the social distancing things or other different remnants of the COVID era, especially like on backstage tours. I remember seeing all kinds of social distancing signs just laying for, garbage and everything. It was really, really cool just to see that, but it's crazy to think how much effort the theme parks put into reopening during that wild time in the world, and seeing how they all differently put in effect all of those changes was very cool to see as well. And it's really cool to reflect on it too, and also to see how little of that actually stuck. One thing that is nice at some parks is the hand sanitizer stayed, even though the hand sanitizer at most parks is not very good. It was nice to be able to clean your hands, like especially before you go to eat. I always like to wash my hands at an amusement park because you're touching a lot of dirty things, and having hand sanitizer right there is always nice. There's not really too many other things though I can think of that really stuck after COVID. I do like the new security system at most parks where it's all touchless. You don't have to stop, you just go. Like Great Adventure specifically, of course, that being my home park, I've experienced it the most. and that is by far so much better than the way it used to be. You just walk right through, and as long as you don't have any odd objects, you never get flags. You just go right through. It's very quick, very seamless. That is probably my favorite change that came from COVID. Of course, there's a lot of really stupid things that came and went, and I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful that we're finally here 3 years later after the whole COVID pandemic started. And I think it's safe to say it's pretty much done now. Of course, people still get sick, but all the major restrictions and stuff are done, which is great. And that's pretty much all I have for today's video. If you guys enjoyed this style of video, be sure to let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe to Collywood Studios. And I'll see you guys in the next video.